what we need to be is conscious about what is going on and what the consequences of the work of organisations like the Royal British Legion are. And I'm going to start with a photograph and a story. So the photograph is this. You might, the person in the middle might be familiar to you. I came across this photograph a few years ago, and it took me a little while to track it down again, actually. And it's pretty unremarkable. It's Margaret Thatcher, then the leader of the opposition, planting a tree. It was National Tree Planting Week. So she's got an awful lot of publicity from that, a nice photo. I suddenly looked at the date, and a sort of slight shiver went down my spine. It was the 9th of November, 1977. And what is interesting is that Mrs. Thatcher doesn't appear to be wearing a poppy. I can only see one poppy in the picture, from that lady over there. She might have been, but I think any politician nowadays would have insisted on the poppy being very, very visible in a publicity shot like that, and it isn't. And that was a society in which I grew up in the 1970s and early 80s. This fixation with remembrance was not a thing in the same way, even though my grandfathers on both sides fought in the two world wars, and one of them was still very much alive then. So, go forward 18 years, and my story. The story is this. I'm a kind of historian of British end of empire and of the Commonwealth. There was a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1995, quite an important one in terms of fixing the architecture of the Commonwealth. Something called the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group was established that policed the values of the Commonwealth, supposedly, values of democracy, human rights, the rule of law. A file was released on this to the National Archives, and I went in and ordered it up, and to my joy, it was a big, thick file. And I thought, gosh, there's going to be lots of material on the creation of CMAG. There wasn't. Let me tell you what that file was about. The Commonwealth Minister and the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was in November 1995, and John Major's government realised rather belatedly that it coincided with Remembrance Sunday. Major was horrified by the idea that he wouldn't be at the cenotaph. But then he sort of took comfort from the idea that the Queen would be at the meeting as well in New Zealand, and wouldn't be there either. Downing Street then learned to its utter horror that the Queen, rather craftily, was planning to go to New Zealand for the opening of the conference and then fly back in time for Remembrance Sunday. So she would be there and Major wouldn't. This huge file was generated by the correspondence around that, about how to manage the optics of Major being absent from the cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday. So in those 18 years, something quite significant, I think, had gone on. My sort of reading of what that was to do actually with the finances of the Royal British Legion, which organised the annual Poppy campaign, the Poppy Appeal. In 1994, the Legion ran into some financial difficulties, or at least raised less money than it had expected to raise, and suddenly went all out in terms of rallying the popular press, trying to get support, trying to really raise the profile of the Poppy campaign. The following year, 1995, saw the revival, for the first time since the interwar period, of a 2-minute silence, not just on Remembrance Sunday, but actually on the 11th of November, Armistice Day. And as the 90s sort of progressed, the campaign became ever more high profile. 1997, they recruited the Spice Girls into the campaign alongside Vera Lynn. They brought in a specialist PR agency, and the PR journalist world were kind of very interested in what that company, Biss Lancaster, had done in terms of writing to TV presenters, asking them to wear poppies, getting the poppy on the mastheads of newspapers, getting poppies in soap operas. So, I mean, this is a kind of a graph for the finances of the Royal British Legion from a book about civil society organisations. Now, you kind of might have expected that there would be a kind of rise in donations in the early 2000s around the sort of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And clearly that increases a kind of I suppose the sort of the emotions, it raises sort of emotions around the event. But actually, the big rise in sort of donations, finances, happens in the late 90s, when you're still in a region of relative peace. Incidentally, the overall graph in terms of the rising finances of the Royal British Legion reflects a number of other civil society organisations devoted to welfare, both in terms of a kind of an increase in their funding, but also an increase in their funding from non-voluntary sources, from government grants and so forth. So the Royal British Legion isn't by any means unusual or unique in that. But in a way, it starts to shape, in a very powerful sense, I think, national memory and ideas of what constitutes national identity and what are the historical markers of national identity. And again, I think thinking about the 2000s, it wasn't just about remembering the dead in Afghanistan, Iraq. There was a real fear in the government, in the Blair and Brown governments, about social cohesion at home, and about integrating people around a kind of a standard national memory and sense of national identity. And Gordon Brown picked up on that. And he's quoted in a very interesting book by Natalia Danilova, comparing the situation around war memory in England and Russia, Britain and Russia. Brown says, perhaps Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday are the nearest we have to a British day that's in every corner of the country, commemorative, unifying, an expression of British ideas, of standing firm in the name of liberty and responsibility and fairness. And again, that's done really not directly by government. That sort of sense of historical memory being shaped very much in the hands of the British Legion, which particularly amongst the sort of young people, school children, has a tremendous reach. It claims that in 2010, over 2.5 million young people in the UK benefited from British Legion materials, learning materials. What does that do? I suppose one major criticism of it is that this sort of relates to the previous presentation. It helps to kind of create a sense of Britain standing alone, this famous Lowe cartoon, wartime cartoon. Whereas in fact the Second World War was an imperial project, and people like David Olusoga have sort of come in and made that argument that in a sense we're misremembering, mismemorializing the history of the Second World War. I think, there's an ambivalence about it because it also perhaps helps to create a myth of the empire marching together and there being some kind of historical debt to the Commonwealth, which Britain has somehow betrayed in subsequent years. So I think it works both ways. And I think that as you sort of see that kind of reification of the idea of sacrifice, struggle in the world wars being key to British national identity, this seeps into political rhetoric in a way that is probably not altogether helpful. Sorry, I like to move around, but I'll try and keep close to the microphone. This was David Cameron's speech in 2013 when he announced that Britain would hold an in-out referendum on the membership of the EU. He goes on in his speech to say why Britain should remain in the EU. Thank you. He goes on to sort of talk about why Britain should remain in the EU. But in the meantime, he talks about over the years, Britain has made her own unique contribution to Europe. We've provided a haven for those fleeing tyranny from persecution. In Europe's darkest hour, we helped keep the flame of liberty alight. Across the continent, in silent cemeteries, lie hundreds of thousands of British servicemen who gave their lives for Europe's freedom. Again, a sense of Europe as being a problem area for Britain historically. And of course, as you might imagine, Nigel Farage was rather more kind of blatant and crude in sort of drawing upon those sort of World War memories. In a speech that he gives in the EU referendum campaign, Farage says, a few days after the EU referendum, it's the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. We should never forget just how much generations have sacrificed. Our democracy is precious, and our right to self-determination is one which has been given away by the political class to the EU. We must seize this chance, this opportunity to take it back. Now, I'm not saying that wartime commemoration framed in that way was responsible solely or in a very major way for the EU vote, but I don't think it helped. And I think that writers who've analysed it have talked about how this sort of idea of the country's national identity shaped around World War II narratives, shaped the Brexit debate. So the notion of British exceptionalism with Europe framed as a historic problem, the notion that UK membership of the EC, EU represented a sort of traumatic surrender of national sovereignty and freedom, which had been defended in the world wars. And the notion that British members of the EC, conversely, represented a betrayal of the Commonwealth and its citizens who'd fought and died alongside Britain in the world wars. And the poppy has certainly been co-opted by far-right groups, and the far right has tried to move closer to organisations, charities like Help for Heroes, who fundraise around this. Help for Heroes actually resisted that pressure, I think, very much, but it's kind of there. The British Legion itself is supposedly there to memorialise the dead, but these are some images from the poppy shop online. You can go and see it. There's a sale on if you want any of these things at the moment. And I think that, there are some of these things which could be seen as quite jingoistic. The kind of the poppy, bulldog, Churchill. There's a whole range of football club poppy merchandise for a range of different clubs. And indeed Spitfire socks, which you can buy. To be fair to them, 2024, they launched a poppy to mark the LGBT dead in the two world wars. But that in itself became part of sort of an annual range of stories criticising some aspect of remembrance, or the kind of the doubt being, people attacking this these sort of sacred acts of remembrance, and the Daily Mail jumped on that. The year before, in 2023, the kind of the angry stories in the press tended to sort of focus on pro-Palestine movements supposedly posing a threat to popusellers or sort of remembrance. So I think that, you know, in a way, the sense in which this whole kind of campaign created by the British Legion and really sort of underlined and pushed very, very hard since the 1990s has been co-opted by the right, and the way that it sort of shaped notions of national identity is something that we've got to take notice of. And just finally, that, you know, there has been pushback. This is, you probably won't be able to hear the sound, but there's sort of captions. This was a short video that the organisation led by Donkeys put out in February 2020, immediately after Britain had formally left the EU. And it's taking that sort of, again, that iconic Vera Lynn World War II image of the White Cliffs of Dover and doing something very, very interesting with it. So you've got a series of veterans wearing their medals, projected against the White Cliffs of Dover, talking about how sad they are that Britain has left the EU, and talking about how, you know, their European identity matters to them as veterans, as people who fought in the world wars. And you could sort of take those veterans and project backwards into the post-war period. Let me stop that. Yeah. And talk about other veterans of the world wars, like Roy Jenkins in the Labour Party, Edward Heath in the Conservative Party, James Grimmond in the Liberal Party, who again fought very bravely and then dedicated part of their political careers to the cause of European unity and to Britain's membership of the EU. So that wartime narrative can't be left uncontested because it's become so important, particularly given that Britain doesn't really think very much about national identity. It doesn't sort of have a kind of clear national curriculum, history curriculum. Those debates are always sort of slightly wishy-washy around, you know, what is a kind of British history. We've tended to kind of keep away from those sorts of debates. So actually that makes the private activities of something like the Royal British Legion all the more important, and I think is a reason why historians should take an interest in what they're doing. So that's it for me. Thank you.